Welcome to the Fishwater People Podcast. I'm Curtis Knight, your host and executive director of California Trout. In this episode, we're focusing on river restoration and water policy, which of course affect fish. But when we talk about healthy rivers and fish, we're really talking about so much more: clean water, thriving ecosystems, resilient groundwater, and even economic benefits. And more often than not, there are laws and policies that inform it all. Bringing a scientific perspective to this conversation is Michael Rogner, Associate Science Director for River Partners. He spent the past 23 years studying riparian habitats along the Sacramento River, working to conserve and restore its incredible biodiversity. I know how deeply connected I am to the Sacramento River through my work as an angler, as a Californian, and I can't wait to talk with him about the restoration efforts happening along its banks. We'll also chat with Karrigan Börk, Interim Director of the UC Davis Watershed Center and Acting Professor of Law at UC Davis. He researches and teaches in the areas of water law, property, environmental law, natural resources law, and administrative law. I'm thrilled to have Karrigan on the show since policy plays such a crucial role in shaping the future. It determines how we restore habitats, manage water resources, and ultimately supports both fish and people. So let's get into the episode and hear some scientific and policy perspectives on the challenges and solutions shaping the future of California's water, wildlife, and communities. All right, Michael, welcome to the Fishwater People Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Curtis. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited. We haven't met, but I certainly know of River Partners, Cal Trout River Partners. Been working together for a long time, and I'm excited to hear your take on how that's all going in the Central Valley. But maybe first, love to hear a little bit about River Partners, and then maybe love to hear more about your background and how you got there.
Sure. So River Partners is a California-based nonprofit. We work on bringing life back to rivers, and how that plays out for us on the ground is that we're doing these very large-scale riparian habitat restoration, typically converting, maybe some old fallow fields or agricultural fields, back into native habitat. We've been around since 1998, and we've restored about 20,000 acres in California. Most of that is in the Central Valley. No, I will say that we also work sort of in the Imperial Valley and other parts of Southern California.
Well, just the scale of that is pretty impressive. I was involved with some of this a couple decades ago, so it's been a while, but I remember there was this strategy of taking over, say, an almond orchard or a walnut orchard. That was a lot of the land. That was a lot of the agricultural activity that was going on that wasn't working out financially for the farmer for whatever reason. And it was almost like tearing out all those trees and then using existing irrigation, existing workforce, and everything else to then plant hundreds of acres sometimes of riparian species, a diverse type of species, in rows. And everybody said, "What are you doing? It doesn't grow in rows." Is that still done, and how does that evolve?
Yeah, so our workforce, we have a little over 100 employees at River Partners, and probably 60 to 65 of them come directly out of the agricultural industry. So they're the people out there putting in irrigation and driving tractors and, doing all of that stuff. I should mention we were founded by a couple of conservation-minded farmers. And so they took the farming model and said, hey, why don't we just roll that out and do habitat restoration that way? And so, one of the ways to think about our work is that we're farming native habitat. Instead of walnuts and almonds, we're doing cottonwoods and willows and, all of the other, it's obviously way more complex than that, but that's, I think, a way that people can sort of get an idea, visual of what it is that we do. And if you're going to work at a scale where you can really impact wildlife species, where you can really recover wildlife, you have to be doing it at a big scale. We would love to be out there sort of planting in groves and doing all these really fine scale adjustments on the landscape, but you just can't do that. It's not cost effective. It's all of the same reasons that farmers farm the way they do. Those things make sense when you start looking at it from an economic perspective. The part of that many people don't get is when, you go out and you look at this young project and you see these trees and it kind of looks like an orchard for the first couple of years. But go back to a project, that's 20 years old or 30 years old or whatever, and you have no idea, first of all, that it was even planted, and second of all, that it was planted in rows. It's just a big, beautiful forest.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. It's such an opportunity to get that scale, cost efficient and actually doable. And yeah, 20,000 acres of that so far in the state. That's really, really impressive. And talk about maybe some of the benefits. I mean, you're really talking about floodplains and these sorts of things. I mean, talk about some of the benefits that you all are looking for. What are your metrics there?
Yeah, so there's very obvious wildlife benefits, that we're monitoring for. So we're going out and we're seeing how the birds respond and how the plants respond. All those sort of metrics of biodiversity that are of interest to the community of folks doing this type of work. Like, we do all of that type of monitoring. But the part that's often not spoken about is sort of the human community. We are working in some of the most impoverished places in California. These places are very park poor. There's not a lot of access to clean water and rivers and all of those things. So all of that is extremely important to our work. If we go in and we do a project for 3 years and we walk away as an organization, we walk away. We might have some employees who live in that community, but for the most part, we're gone. And so if the locals don't feel some sort of ownership and don't feel like their lives are improving by these projects, then the projects are a failure. One of the very clear ways that they benefit is groundwater recharge. We're pulling a lot less water out of rivers because we turn off the irrigation systems. These irrigation systems may have been in operation for 50 years or 100 years. We use them for 3 and then turn them off forever. So it's a lot less water coming out of the river. There's all sorts of flood control benefits. There's a lot of reasons to be doing these projects outside of just the wildlife benefit.
Yeah, you're talking about all the multiple benefits, but you got to tie it to the people as well. So, Michael, what's your title here? What's your role in this whole thing you got going on?
Yeah, I'm the science director for River Partners. So I co-lead a team of about 30 ecologists who are out doing the fun work of recovering biodiversity. I've been here for 18 years. I moved here 25 years ago for what I thought would be just like a 4-month technical position, studying birds on the Sacramento River, and I just fell in love with the place and have been here ever since.
So you're based in Chico there, kind of the heart of the Sacramento Valley. That's where River Partners has been headquartered for a while, I think, right?
Yeah, we started based out of Chico, and this is sort of the stretch of the middle stretch of the Sacramento River where you're above the part of the river that is just really constricted by levees, and you're below the mountain reaches. So, we're sort of in the last remaining alluvial stretch of the Sacramento River, which is, it's a really magical place to be.
Yeah, it is. It's gorgeous. I think, having floated that section a little bit, Chico down, especially down to Ord Bend and those types of areas, not a lot of people do that. And it's such a scenic float, and you get glimpses of what that river used to be like.
Absolutely. If anybody has not been on the river, anywhere from Red Bluff to Colusa, just get out on the river and it'll blow your mind.
It'll blow your mind. And you don't see it. You don't see it otherwise. You don't see it on I-5. You don't see it on the corridors. Our largest river in the state, such an important section of it, is hidden. I mean, maybe we can walk it down from Shasta Dam and then how it evolves down into levees. Can you talk a little bit about that progression of the Sacramento River? Just because, I think the plumbing of that river sometimes is hard for people to grasp.
Yeah, once you get below the dams, there's a big stretch of river that is really sediment starved. It's just gravel, cobble bottoms because there's, the dam stops all of that sediment. And it's sort of flowing through this really gorgeous, scenic foothill environment until it gets to the city of Red Bluff. That's where it really hits the valley floor, and there's a 100-mile stretch. And now in that area, a bunch of tributaries have flowed into the river, and so there's a lot more sediment in the stream, and it sort of looks, like a river and behaves like one still meanders around a little bit. At some point, right around the Butte-Glenn County line, which, sort of almost due west of Chico, you enter the state plan of flood control. And so you've got these big levees on either side of the river that begin to sort of keep the water in that channel, to keep it from flowing into communities that have sprouted up along the Sacramento River. And then once you get down to Colusa, that's where the river really becomes channelized. And then the beautiful thing about how California manages water is the bypass system. So there's these big flood bypasses that take all of the water out of the channel, when it's flooding, and sort of flush it around Sacramento so that Sacramento doesn't flood. I mean, I can't even describe it here in a couple of minutes. It's a very complex, heavily managed river. And when you sort of back up and take that 10,000-foot view, you can sort of see why salmon and other wildlife are just having such a terrible time because of how we've industrialized our rivers.
Yeah, and in that one especially, I mean, you can look at all the tributaries that have been cut off for salmon and steelhead spawning, and I think that's something that people understand. A dam went up, fish can't get up there. Mm-hmm. I think what people less understand is the constraints that's happened in the valley floor, and really that's at the heart of what you're trying to recreate. Is this, essentially what filled up as a bathtub every spring, the entire Central Valley, was this rearing ground for fish, birds, you name it, groundwater recharge, everything. And that just got funneled in. And maybe let's just talk about the engineering of the river, though, in that context a little bit, because I think there's a reason you're in Chico, it sounds like. There's a reason River Partners is right there. There's this sort of stretch, like you said, 100 miles, Colusa to Red Bluff, roughly. Is that what you're talking about? Where some of these river dynamics that were lost are still sort of there? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. What we've done to so many of our rivers by damming them and diverting them and building these levees, we've taken away what makes them a river. Rivers erode soil during high water events. They move it downstream and they deposit it, out on the floodplains. And it's this constant cycling of that, which creates, habitat, which is used by more wildlife than any other habitat on Earth. And by putting up dams and constraining it with levees, we've disrupted all of those natural processes. And so if we were to just walk away from all that land right now and just say, okay, we're just not going to touch it and it's going to revert back to what it was, well, that's never going to happen, because the processes that created that habitat in the first place no longer exist. And so that's where River Partners comes in, is we have to be actively managing these floodplains, planting millions of trees, doing all of that stuff, because it's not coming back on its own.
Right. You got to adapt. You got to figure out how to work within a very structured system, one that's been highly altered, and figure out a way to find some ways to insert some of those natural processes back in. And I love that it's happening at scale. Let me just stick with the plumbing a little bit more, because I think it's fascinating, that river. Maybe we just talk about the Yolo bypass in particular, because I think most people know it, even if they don't know it. Right by the Sacramento airport on I-5, you cross right over it. Sometimes it has water in it. Sometimes, most often not. Talk about some of the efforts that a lot of us have been working on to really take advantage of that really unique habitat.
Yeah, if you drive past the bypasses in the summertime, you're not going to notice anything besides, some agriculture happening. But when you get some of these bigger wintertime storms, there's these overflows all along the Sacramento River that fill up the bypasses, and it allows California to sort of move water. If the Sacramento's flooding, it can move some water over to the Feather. It can move water in the Yolo bypass around Sacramento, etc. But what that does is it creates these huge sort of shallow water refugias that salmon are streaming through. Fish can do great in the bypass with some minor modifications. And so let's do it. Let's stop worrying about some of the things that we can't control, like the dam being there or the levees that we're not going to remove. And let's focus on what we can do, which is make some modifications to these bypasses to make them better for fish.
Yeah, and the fish are really showing the way there too. I mean, we see this. You see this when you have those wet years, when those bypasses activate. The fish returns a few years later are typically good. I mean, when we can get them there. And I know there's a lot of efforts underway to activate that, not just in really wet years, but how to activate that habitat more often. I don't know if it's every year, but more often.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of the different bypasses, have different levels at which they activate. So there are some, like the Calusa bypass is really low, the Calusa Weir. And so that bypass can probably be activated multiple times every year, where some of the other ones, maybe you only get them in the big storms. But if you think about what salmon evolved which was this very complex, always changing sort of wetland estuary environment down in this stretch of the Sacramento River, the bypasses kind of mimic that. Some years they're going to be really good habitat, some years they won't. The fish kind of figure out where to go.
Right. The bypass idea, I remember just hearing those early stories of how early settlements in the Sacramento Valley, one levee on one side would go a little higher and the people on the other side would build theirs a little bit higher, and they'd be fighting this war. And then, every couple years, these big storms come and just wipe everybody out. And that mentality of, hey, we can harness this river, maybe from on the East Coast, we can harness this river. They just said, we can't handle these big storms that come in during the wintertime. They're so intense, the rain on snow ones, we call them atmospheric rivers now. So that was kind of this idea of a relief valve was born.
Yep. Yeah, there's a famous picture of Leland Stanford canoeing to the Capitol in Sacramento, because that used to happen all the time in Sacramento. It was always underwater because it was, you get these big storms and big floods, and the bypasses sort of relieve that. But at some point, they can only relieve so much. Sacramento is still at tremendous flood risk. We need to continue to set back levees and do these other things to, make the flood capacity a little bit bigger. But certainly the bypasses are the big engineering solution that has worked so well.
And making that flood capacity bigger too, the levees are where they're at. And moving levees back seems like, oh yeah, but it's extremely hard. But you talk about all the multiple benefits that you get by increasing that flood capacity, as you mentioned it. Can you just talk a little bit about all the added benefits that you get?
Yeah, we've worked on this project called Dos Rios. It's called now Dos Rios State Park. But it's immediately upstream from this small town called Grayson. And one of the problems that made Grayson an unsafe place to live was that it would flood easily. And there were these levees that surrounded Dos Rios, which is at the confluence of the Tuolumne and San Joaquin rivers. And they blocked water from getting out of the channel and onto just floodplain forested habitat where the water would be great. And instead, it kept it in the channel and ended up flooding out this little town of Grayson. And so a few years ago, there was a big rain event, and the woman who ran the National Wildlife Refuge went out and just punched a hole in this federal levee that we had been trying to get a hole in for 20 years. And if you look at the river gauge, you see, like, right when the hole gets punched through, the water surface elevation in Grayson dropped by like 18 inches or something, crazy. Basically, it would have been in everybody's living room. Instead, they just had wet streets. It saved all of these homes. And so you think about that. That's just one small, tiny place in California. There's 100 of those places that if we could just get water into smarter places, it would keep it from flooding out people's homes and communities that have been there for decades.
Well, so yeah, you're giving people ideas here. We just take our shovels out and see if we can dig some holes in these things or get this thing rolling. That's one way to do it. Take initiative.
Yeah, exactly. Some guerrilla restoration. Just don't put my name on it. Yeah.
That's right. Didn't start here. That idea didn't start here.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. But that Dos Rios is so important. It's such a great model project, like you're saying. It's talking about public safety and flooding, and then all the benefits that come with flooding. The groundwater recharge is so desperately needed in the San Joaquin. The habitat for birds and fish and wildlife and everything else is so many multiple benefits to that work. And amazingly, that also got transformed into California's newest state park.
Yeah, first state park in 13 years. And it's in a place that doesn't have a lot of parkland. It's just such a wonderful resource for the community, and to walk around out there and just to see people out picnicking, holding hands and having lunch, whatever. It's such a great, wonderful thing to see.
Yeah, that's that real connection to community that you were talking about earlier. That's so important part of this work. Well, Michael, this is awesome. It's inspiring to hear what River Partners is doing, the scale that it's doing at. And so I just say, thanks for doing what you do. And thanks for River Partners for being a good partner to CalTrout and so many others to make California a better place. Appreciate it.
Yeah, right back at you. Thank you for all of the wonderful work that CalTrout does. And the more organizations we can get like this doing big projects, the better we're going to be.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks for joining the pod, Michael.
Thank you.
Join us for the inaugural Fishwater People Film Festival hosted by California Trout. It'll be an evening of storytelling, connection, and celebration of the lands and waters that shape us and our state. The festival features a lineup of incredible films that bring conservation and community to the forefront, not just stories about fish, but about the people who care for them, depend on them, and fight for their future. From exciting adventures to intimate portraits of people and places, these films remind us why California's rivers, streams, and coastal waters matter. The first screenings of the Fishwater People Film Fest will kick off in mid-May in the Bay Area, with additional screenings happening throughout California. So mark your calendars, check out our show notes for more information and the link to purchase your tickets. All right, Karrigan Börk, welcome to the Fishwater People podcast.
Hey, happy to be here. This is great.
Yeah, we're excited to have you on. I mean, you have a pretty unique background, both from the biological side, but also the law too. So I'm really interested to talk to you about how you intertwine those two things and maybe just give everybody a little bit of recap on your journey, your experiences to get you where you are today.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a professor at UC Davis at the law school here. I've been here for a little over 5 years now, but I'm also serving right now as interim director at the UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences. I did a PhD in ecology, kind of wrapped around law school. I thought for a long time I wanted to be a conservation biologist. Like that was my thing. I grew up fishing at a farm pond in Kansas, loved being outside, wanted to find a career where I could do that, and realized pretty quickly that like just having really good science isn't enough. Like we definitely need it, but no matter how good your science is, if you don't have law that gets that science into practice, it gets pretty frustrating. And so I thought I'd probably be well served by getting a law degree also.
Just being a fish biologist myself, and then you think about the law side. I used to always think it's black and white. The law is just the law, but boy, it is not. I mean, talk a little bit about the nuance of California water law and how that sort of comes to play with us trying to do what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I teach a water law class here, and the first day of class, these students come in and they're super excited about learning water law, and they're asking me all these questions. And every question they ask, I say, well, it depends. I can't really give you an answer to that question. And then we spend a lot of time talking about why, and that's mostly what we do over the semester is really kind of understand why California water is so complicated. And then by the very end of it, I'm asking these students questions on the final, and every one of their answers starts with, it depends. And
they learn from you.
That's how I know they're ready to go be California water lawyers at that point.
Excellent teacher. What'd you learn from Professor Bork? Well, it depends. That's what we learned. Yeah, that's good. Well, maybe just for our listeners too, I mean, Water Law 101, can you give us the short version of your entire semester's course?
Sure. Let me just squeeze that down for you. No problem. Yeah. So kind of when I think about water law, the way that I've really come understand it in California and understand kind of the complications and the reasons we fight so much about it, I think back to how water rights first started in California. When California became a state, we needed laws. Every state needs laws. And so our legislature looked around and said, we got to come up with a lot of laws on the fly. Like, murder should probably be illegal. We got to have ways to make a contract. We got to figure out like what happens to your property when you die. I mean, there's so many questions the legislature has to answer. And so when California first became a state, we brought in the law of England. Legislature said, we're just going to use English common law to be the law of California. And whatever we want to change, we'll change. But if we don't change it, it's going to be English law. And so that brought in riparian rights, which was the water rights we used in England. And this English riparian rights were tied to land ownership. So if you owned land that was next to a water course under English common law, you had the right to use that water on your land, use a reasonable amount, a reasonable way, reasonable method of using that water. All those things kind of went into this riparian right. And that was pretty good way to do water rights in England, and a pretty good way to do water rights in the eastern part of the United States, where it rains a lot and where you don't need to irrigate land. But it wasn't a great fit for California. You're not allowed to store water under riparian rights. You can't use water on land that's not riparian. Can't really transfer that water. And if we only used riparian rights in California, we wouldn't be able to use water on farmland that didn't butt up against a waterway. Well, that's a lot of the land that we farm in California. And so early Californians figured out another way to do this would be appropriative rights. And this is a right that's not based on owning land. It's based on going out and actually appropriating water. So you go out, you start using the water. As soon as you divert it, you start using it. You put it to a beneficial purpose. You're not wasting it or anything. And that created a right. And up until about 1914, if you wanted to get an appropriative right, you didn't ask the state. There was no analysis. There was no, is this in the public's interest? It would just go start using water. Both those kinds of water rights are still good water rights in California today. And so that means that these water rights reflect land ownership and reflect social objectives from more than 100 years ago at this point.
When there was maybe 40,000 people in California instead of 40 million or whatever the number is.
Exactly. A little bit different.
A little bit different. Right.
And then this window of like 1914 through maybe 1983, we had a water board. Water board's issuing permits, but it wasn't going out and making decisions about whether it thought the permits that the people were applying for were a good idea or not. It saw itself as having what we call a ministerial role. All it did was say, is there water in the river? If there's water, then you get to take it. So pre-1914 riparian, and then what I call like the second tranche of water rights, these 1914 to 1983-ish water rights, just don't have any consideration of, say, endangered species or kind of what we as a state want to be doing with our water.
And is that where you have this appropriative right, you have the riparian right, those kind of come together to be our water rights system, for better or worse, messy or not, whatever. And then there's also this idea of the public trust doctrine. Can you talk about how that sort of fits into this whole thing too?
Sure. So public trust doctrine is this like ancient Roman doctrine that said there's certain resources that are so vital for the country and so vital for the health and welfare, the people of the country, that the country can't get rid of these things. And it's the job of the country or the ruler or whoever to protect these things, to hold them like in trust for the people. And this is a trust in the same way that, like, you know, if your parents have tons of money and they put money into a trust fund for you. So we're all, you know, trust fund babies of the public trust, really. And the state inherited that responsibility going all the way back to the English colonies. So there's a kind of through line you can follow there all the way back to that Roman law. And that means when the state does certain things, like trying to give away the trust, it's actually illegal. The state doesn't have that power. And it also means the state has a lot of power to regulate things that might impact the public trust resources. So again, this came up a couple of different cases. The National Audubon's the most famous one, but there's a case a couple of years before that, Marks v. Whitney, that was a big fight over on Tomales Bay about this little beach, Chicken Ranch Beach. And there was a guy who was trying to build up the shoreline, and another guy who owned land uphill from him. And the guy uphill said, hey, the public's got a right to go across this beach area, and I'm gonna assert that. I'm gonna protect the right of public access here. And it went all the way up to California Supreme Court. And the California Supreme Court said, yeah, there's a right here for the public to cross this land to get to the bay here. And this one dude who lives uphill can assert that right on behalf of all of us. He's a beneficiary of the trust, and so he can assert that right. And so it's a cool case because it says there's this interest, and we can all like protect it and force the state to protect it for us.
Right. As an individual, you can even make a difference there.
Yeah.
Let's keep going on that, because I think there's a great example, and you brought it up with the Audubon case back in the 80s. And maybe we can talk about Mono Lake a little bit in the sense of how the public trust came into play, and then also one specific piece of California water law, Fish and Game Code 5937. But first, for some background information, Fish and Game Code section 5937 requires dam owners to release enough water to keep fish in good condition below the dam. That law was used in the Mono Lake case to force the state to review water rights for the tributaries to the lake, and the ruling ended nearly 50 years of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power diverting water without regard to the impact on fish and the streams and ultimately Mono Lake. It's a perfect example of law making a big shift in ecological practices. Karrigan, give us some more details on all that.
So we get this Marks v. Whitney case, says there's a public trust in California, says that the state can't alienate it, says that we, the public, can assert this right. And it covers tidelands, it covers navigable waterways. After Marks v. Whitney, it covers the ecological interest, the open space, protection of the environment a little bit, starts coming in there. And that puts like the public trust in California on this huge collision course with water law, where the water board has been handing out these rights willy-nilly since 1914. And then more generally, before that, people could just go out and claim that water use. And there was never any protection of the public trust. But it's not until that National Audubon case hits that we actually see how a court's going to resolve this. And so you got LA. LA is diverting water from all the tributary streams that would have flowed down into Mono Lake with the habitats wrecked because the water's been cut off. Big habitat and flow problems there. So a couple different groups get together and they sue under the name of National Audubon, and they file a lawsuit and say, hey, these water rights didn't consider the public trust, so there's a problem. And the court looks at it. The state Supreme Court says, yeah, actually the public trust is good law in California, and it applies to water rights. The water rights system doesn't win out over the public trust. And that 5937 piece came in when the water board was trying to figure out how much water to release downstreams, eventually flowing into Mono Lake, but really trying to restore those fisheries.
So you had this effort behind Mono Lake, highly publicized too. I mean, what a campaign. Everybody's kind of rallied around this because it was bird habitat, it was air quality, and then fish in all the tributaries. And so you had this 1-2 punch of the public trust doctrine. But then this Fish and Game Code 5937 that we really picked up, and others, to apply that state law on those rivers. And 5937 is so interesting because of its long history and sort of its simplicity, where it essentially says, keep fish in good condition. And boy, is that kind of vague-ish. So given all that context, here comes that law trying to be applied on this situation as well.
I mean, it's crazy because we think about these problems with water shortages as being this new thing and you know, oh, this is just like only shown up in the last 30 or 40 years, but that's not true. I mean, in California, the first mentions you get of rivers going dry are from like the 1890s. I mean, it's as soon as people started building dams and diverting water during the dry summers, you had rivers running dry. So there were all these kind of efforts that the water board was basically ignoring, but that the Fish and Game Commission was pushing to try and keep water in rivers to protect these fish populations. One of the big ones they got was this section 5937 of the Fish and Game Code. This first was in the penal code, right? This was a criminal law. And so if you were a dam owner and you weren't following it, you could get a misdemeanor citation, you could get a year in jail, you could get big fines would come in. But from the very beginning, nobody enforced this. It really wasn't until after Marks v. Whitney and then National Audubon that it kind of became a thing again.
Yeah, it's remarkable too in that you have real tangible things, a big appropriative water right owned by LADWP, this big entity, and that this law that says keep fish in good condition is able to take precedent over that. Let's just talk about some current times a little bit. Federal versus state. When we think about water and jurisdictions and these sorts of things, it gets really confusing.
Yeah. And this has just been in the news a ton lately because our new President Trump, has been talking a lot about the Delta smelt. It's been something he pushed through the campaign, and that's some of these initial executive orders that came through. And so it's something that we're hearing a lot about right now. But you're wrestling with, like you say, a lot of different pieces here: the state law, the federal law, and I guess the other law is kind of the natural law of the river, the hydrology of these systems that has a lot to do with the flow that we actually see through. Say for the Delta is probably the biggest example.
The jurisdictions are sort of intertwined a little bit too. I think the Clean Water Act is a good example where the Clean Water Act, a federal law, but it's a state that does a lot of the carrying out of the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, so Federal Clean Water Act, and then implemented by the state's Porter-Cologne Act, and this one's interesting for a whole lot of reasons. The way you set standards under the Porter-Cologne Act and under the Clean Water Act generally is you figure out what uses you want to protect in a waterway. So you look at the Sacramento and say, hey, we want to have it fishable, swimmable, and we want it to be cold water fish habitat and good spawning habitat. And after you pick those uses, then you set the standards you need to achieve those uses for the waterways. And the federal government has delegated responsibility to the states, and the states actually get a little bit of veto power over federal actions that would otherwise keep the state from being able to protect the uses that it's picked under Porter-Cologne. And so even though there's a lot of power on the federal side, the state gets to come in over that and to regulate the federal uses in a lot of ways. And so when you talk about the operation of the Central Valley Project, operation of the State Water Project, and you layer on top of that something like the Porter-Cologne Act that's regulating water quality across the Delta, it means that no matter how much you want to store water and export a lot of water using those projects, you still have to comply with that state water quality law, state flow laws that come from the water board. And that's painful because people have been using that water that way for a long time. Politically, I think it's actually much more difficult than it is legally to do.
None of this stuff is very straightforward at all.
No, it's just remarkably complicated. And it's good for water lawyers because it keeps you in business. And I'm sure there's a lawyer to water ratio somebody has worked out for making these calls. But, ultimately, if California and if the lawmakers in the state and the water apparatus, if they're willing to go to bat and to keep pushing back on decisions that would otherwise dewater rivers, the state has the power to do that.
Karrigan, I think we're coming towards the end here. Is there anything we didn't cover that you wanted to cover?
I think the blog, I think I should mention for the Center for Watershed Sciences, California Water Blog. Check it out. It's a great resource. We publish there a lot. We're always looking for new contributors. So, any of your listeners who've got something that they're interested in sharing on the science side, feel free to reach out and hit us up. There's links on the website to do that. I think that's one of the big things, and just real pleasure chatting with you about all this stuff, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, that was great, Karrigan. Thanks for joining. All right, wow, that was a jam-packed episode, and I feel like I learned a lot. But now for something a little different. We're going to pull in one of the producers of the Fish Water People podcast, Bridget Shaw. Bridget, you're always behind the scenes. Welcome to the Fish Water People podcast.
Thanks for having me. So, before we wrap up, something that you and I talked about is that it seems worth it to take a closer look at one piece of the conversation. Water Law 101. I know water's at the top of your mind these days, Curtis. It's a major part of your work. It affects everyone. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So I wanted to make sure we actually learned some facts from the episode, and if there's one tried and true method for checking if you remember what a professor told you, it's a quiz. Curtis, are you ready?
Okay, been a long time for a professor quiz, but I'm ready.
All right, I believe in you. Okay, question 1. If I own land next to a river, can I just start taking water to irrigate?
Well, if we learned anything from Karrigan, it's to respond to these questions with, it depends. So hopefully I got that part of the quiz right.
You'd be proud.
Yeah. So owning land adjacent to a river doesn't automatically grant you unlimited water rights to take it. But owning land next to a river can give you riparian rights to use for reasonable and beneficial use, and that's a state term. And you can't cause harm to downstream users. And with a riparian right, you cannot store water. So you'd need to get a permit if you wanted to actually store water.
All right.
How'd I do? How'd I do?
You're a natural. You sound like you know what you're talking about to me.
Yeah, it depends.
It depends. All right, next one. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. If I don't own land next to a creek, could I still possibly obtain water for irrigation or storage?
Right. So Karrigan talked a little bit about this. And again, it depends, but there is a process for doing that. You must get a water right permit from the State Water Resources Control Board. It's a costly and time-consuming process. After you submit an application, it goes through environmental impact review, then goes out to public notice. Here, your application can be protested, which happens frequently, especially in California, where water is scarce and often over-allocated.
Right. So takeaway is it sounds really difficult to obtain new water rights in California.
Yes, for several reasons, and Karrigan touched on this. I mean, we live in a Mediterranean climate where water is scarce, especially seasonally, and we're over-allocated. There's 40 million people in our state, and we just discussed this lengthy process that is often challenged to obtain a water right. So even if you did get a water right, there's a seniority system in place where, as a newer water right, you're in a junior status, meaning in some years, especially drier years, you might not get any water at all.
Okay, for sure. The takeaway is that it's super complicated.
Yeah.
Okay, my next question, Curtis, is big picture. Who owns the water in California?
Yeah, and that one's complicated too. I think our policy people would tell us it's a trick question.
It is a bit of a trick question. That's kind of what I remember.
Yeah, well, Karrigan mentioned the public trust doctrine, which I think is really important to understand. And in California, it's a legal principle that holds that certain natural resources, including navigable waters, rivers and creeks, are preserved for public use and cannot be privately owned or controlled in a way that harms the public interest. Karrigan talked about this in relation to the Moore Lake case.
Right. And my takeaway from Karrigan was that the right to use it is controlled by a mix of historic water rights, state and federal laws, and regulatory agencies within that umbrella of the public trust doctrine, right? So it's no wonder that literally every answer to every question starts with, it depends.
Yeah, it depends, and go consult your attorney. That's probably the two biggest things.
Yeah, maybe we'll hear from Karrigan if we got any of this wrong.
Oh, I'm sure we will.
Well, I think he did pretty great. If I was your professor, I would say A+.
Oh, wow.
But you did well at all those questions. So, it makes me kind of wonder just how often do you think about water law in your day to day? I mean, it's tied up in your work. Is it once a week, 2 times a day, 10 times a day?
Yeah, well, certainly our staff do a lot. And I mean, water specifically, and then all those rules that regulate it for sure. I mean, it's central to what we do. Fish, rivers, people need water. We're constantly trying to find that balance between all of these competing needs. It was something we got involved with about 10 years ago that I was quite involved with, was the passing of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act to manage groundwater pumping. We talked a lot about the surface water regulation is out there, but California is one of the last states to introduce a comprehensive statewide groundwater management system. So now there's ways to regulate how much water is actually pumped out of the ground for use, which is a really important aspect to water use in California. But, I think conflicts are always right there with California and California water, especially during drought. I mean, we're in an amazing run of 3 pretty wet years right now. Mm-hmm. And so you kind of quick to forget how contentious water is, especially second, third, fourth year of drought when reservoir levels are low, streams are running dry. That's when we really see a lot of these water rights come into play.
Right. Yeah. I think the only reason it's even on my radar, even though I grew up in California, I grew up in Siskiyou County. So water rights are a huge part of life up here, right? We have fish in our rivers, hopefully. We have agriculture. We have the headwaters of major rivers. But it's only talking to folks from California Trout, specifically Reggie Collins, your legal and policy director, who really opened my eyes to just how complex it is. And it makes me very grateful for people like you all, people like Karrigan, doing the hard work, doing our best to get all that information put together.
It's so messy. It is amazing how messy it is for a resource that's really ultimately one of the most important aspects of our state is our water.
Definitely. It's an interesting topic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Curtis. This is fun.
Yeah, well, thank you, Bree. Great to have you on here, and so cool to learn from our guests more about this complex issue of water in California. I'm Curtis Knight, Executive Director of Cal Trout and your host of the Fishwater People podcast. Thanks so much to Michael Rogner and Karrigan Börk for joining us, and many, many thanks to Wilco for our theme song. This episode was written, produced, and engineered by Bridget Shaw and Drew Alvarez of Pusher Media. on the banks of the Sacramento River in the historic train and trout town of Dunsmuir, California.